Hello, my most amazing artists! How are you today? Are you ready to create? Then let's get started. Today, we are going to learn about the word texture. Texture is the word we use to describe what something feels like. Here are some words that can be used to describe something's texture. Rough, smooth, hard, soft, bumpy, slimy, fuzzy, gritty, prickly, wrinkly, rubbery. Can you think of any other words? What word would you choose to describe the texture of these animals? I would use the word prickly. How about a crocodile? What words could we use? How about rough and bumpy? We could use words like scaly and spiky. This pufferfish is also spiky. Slimy, smooth, gritty, soft, and feathery. Squishy or rubbery. Hard and spiky. Scaly. Rough. Wrinkly, soft, hairy, and very fluffy. When it comes to art, how do artists use texture in their work? Well, if it's a three-dimensional piece of art, a sculpture, artists can use texture in the materials, in the clay. They can create texture out of stone. They can add things to make it look like the texture of what they're trying to create. Artists can also give the impression, an illusion of texture on a flat drawing or painting, a two-dimensional piece of art. If you touch a drawing, it doesn't feel like anything. If you touch a painting, it doesn't always have any texture. But artists can draw and paint in ways that give the illusion that it's soft or feathery or fluffy or bumpy or spiky. This is called implied texture. Artists use different painting techniques in order to create the illusion of texture. The way they use their brush, the way they apply the paint will create different effects and will make us think that it has texture, even when it doesn't. And the same is true for drawing. The way that artists draw with a pencil or a marker, they can create different effects, different illusions of texture by the way that they draw and the lines that they choose to use. Let's look at some art by the German artist Albrecht Dürer. He was born in Germany in 1471 and he was a Renaissance artist. He loved to draw and paint animals. How did he create texture in his drawings and paintings? Dürer painted this picture, The Young Hare, in 1502. It's a watercolor painting with such intricate detail. You feel like you can see every single hair. It is such a delicate piece of art that it's only shown once every 12 years. Today we are going to draw an animal together and we are going to show the texture of the animal. We're going to imply the texture by the way that we draw and color it. Now the
animal that we're going to draw is a bear. But not any old bear. A very rare type of bear.
Paddington, Paddington, Paddington bear, Paddington, Paddington, Paddington bear. He came from Peru to be with me and you. He's a very rare sort of bear. Paddington, Paddington bear. Paddington, Paddington bear.
I love the stories of Paddington by Michael Bond. It's another story that I grew up reading. I particularly love the illustrations by R.W. Alley. I love the way he's captured Paddington's texture, the way he's used line, and the way that he's coloured his fur really makes me think that Paddington is a soft, fluffy bear. My favourite picture is when Paddington has come out of the bath and is clean and soft and fluffy. I am going to show you how to draw and colour so that we can give Paddington the right texture. Here's what you'll need: a piece of paper, a pencil and eraser, and colouring supplies. Colouring pencils or crayons work best for this project. You're going to need different shades of brown if you have them. Ideally you want 3 or 4 different shades of brown, ranging from light brown like a tan colour all the way through to dark brown or even to black. If you don't have different shades of brown, you could substitute them and instead use yellow, orange, brown and black. And finally you need red and yellow for the hat. So grab your supplies and let's begin. We're going to start by drawing the shape of Paddington's head. Find the middle of your paper and slightly above the middle, draw a round oval shape. Your oval should look like an egg lying on its side. Draw it lightly with your pencil because later we're going to use a different texture line. Next we're going to draw a large oval for Paddington's body. Start at the bottom of his head and draw a great big oval. Once again, don't forget to draw really lightly. Now we're going to add Paddington's arms. Starting at the bottom of his head, draw 2 ovals, one on each side, going along the side of his body. At the bottom of his body, draw 2 ovals for his legs. And now let's add his feet with 2 more ovals. At the top of his head, use 2 round circles for his ears, and inside do 2 smaller circles for the inner part of his ear. Now we're going to start implying the texture by using a bumpy, zigzaggy line. Start on Paddington's head by going around the oval shape with a zigzag, fluffy, furry line. Next we're going to use the same type of line to trace around the outer part of the ears and the inner part of the ears. Now let's use the same texture line to trace down his left arm, but let's stop at the bottom because Paddington should be holding something. See if you can guess what it is that Paddington's going to hold. Let's start by drawing an oval. Then add 2 lines either side going down and finish with a curvy line to make a cylinder. Add another curvy line just beneath the top oval. Then add some vertical lines to add texture. Let's add a wavy line. Can you guess what it is yet? That's right, it's a jar of marmalade, Paddington's favourite. Add an M for marmalade. In his other hand, we're going to draw him carrying his red hat. Start with an oval shape. Add a curvy line to make the top of his hat. Add a couple of small lines to add the texture at the top of his hat. Add a smaller oval shape inside to create the inside of his hat. And finally, add one more curvy line to create what will be the yellow band that wraps around his red hat. Now back to the texture of Paddington. Let's do his other arm using that zigzaggy line. And his hand. Now for the body. Leave a little space from under his head and use the zigzag line to go down the left side of his body, then down his leg, across his foot, continue all the way around, back up the leg, across, down the other leg, across his foot, up the other side, until you meet back up at his hand, completing the whole of Paddington's body with his fuzzy wuzzy texture line. In the middle of Paddington's face, use an oval to create his nose and colour it in, but leave a tiny little white gap for the shine. Draw a small straight line going down from the bottom of his nose. Use a curvy line to create his smile, and use two little lines at the end to finish his smile. Now we're going to draw a curvy line that goes around his nose. And let's finish his face by giving him two oval eyes. Next, to add the colour. Sort your colours from darkest to lightest. You're going to need your lightest colour first. If you have a light brown or a tan or a peach or a yellow, let's start with that. First, colour the area around the nose and mouth and cheeks. We can also imply texture by the way that we colour. Colour from the centre of his face to the outside of his head, going back and forth from the middle to the outside, until you've gone all the way around his face. This is already starting to create the texture of his fur. Colour his inner ears, the smaller circles. Next, we're going to colour his tummy, starting at the bottom of his face. Colour a little bit, then stop. Underneath, colour a little bit more, then stop. And keep moving down as you colour. You're trying to create layers of fur by colouring and then moving down a bit and colouring some more and moving down a bit. We're colouring in the direction of his fur, and the way that we use our pencil is trying to show the texture of his fur. Now colour a little bit on his arms and his legs too. Time to move to your next darker shade. That could be an orange or it could be a slightly darker brown. We're only going up a little bit, but this brown should be just a bit darker. Start with the ears, the outside of the ears. Colour them in with your next shade of brown. Now back to the face. Go back on top of what you've already coloured. Don't go all the way into the middle. Just colour around the edge. And as we colour on top of our lightest shade, it begins to blend together. It adds depth. And it makes it way more realistic when we blend colours together. Now we should see some of the lighter colour and some of the darker colour showing through. Now, colour in the arms. Colour in the places that you haven't coloured already and blend in a little bit with the lighter shade. And do the same on the stomach and on the legs. Don't colour all the way into the centre of his body. The middle of his body should be the lightest shade. Just colour around the edges, and we're making sure that we're blending those colours together. Now for my next darkest shade, I'm going a little bit darker again. This should be your brown. If you've already used yellow and orange, This is your brownie colour, your darker shade. Again, I'm going to go around the edges. I'm not going to go into the middle. I'm building up the colour so that it's darkest at the edges of the face, the edges of the arms, underneath the chin. There'd be a little bit of a shadow. But the middle of his tummy is going to stay the lightest. It'll be darker around his arms, darker around the edge of his body. And now I'm going a shade darker. This time I found a reddy brown to add a little bit of red in there. If you've got a reddy brown, or if you've just got a red, you could gently add a tiny bit of red or a dark orange to add another colour to make it look more realistic. Now I'm going to blend in my dark brown. Notice how the way I'm colouring is adding texture. I'm using a jaggedy way of colouring, zigzaggy lines. A little bit messy, but when it all blends together, it ends up looking like the fluff and the texture. So don't be afraid to use some jaggedy colouring lines here. When we blend all those different shades of brown and red and orange, it's going to look really realistic. I'm going to finish my picture by going around my lines with a black pencil. This will just highlight all the things I've drawn, the nose, the eyes, the mouth. And if I go around the outside edge of Paddington Bear, it will also add an extra dimension of texture. Look how it really looks fluffy when I add that final bit of black. It really starts to bring it to life. Finish your picture by colouring in your jar of marmalade, Paddington's red hat with the yellow band around it. So why did Paddington end up in the bath, and what happened? Let's read the story of Paddington. Mr. and Mrs. Brown first met Paddington on a railway platform. In fact, that was how he came to have such an unusual name for a bear, because Paddington was the name of the station. The Browns were waiting for their daughter Judy when Mr. Brown noticed something small and furry near the left luggage office. "It looks like a bear," he said. "A bear?" repeated Mrs. Brown. "In Paddington Station? Don't be silly, Henry. There can't be." But Mr. Brown was right. It was sitting on an old leather suitcase marked "Wanted on Voyage." As they drew near, it stood up and politely raised its hat. "Good afternoon," it said. "May I help you?" "It's very kind of you," said Mr. Brown, "but as a matter of fact, we were wondering if we could help you." "You're a very small bear," said Mrs. Brown. "Where are you from?" The bear looked around carefully before replying. "Darkest Peru. I'm not really supposed to be here at all. I'm a stowaway." "You don't mean to say you've come all the way from South America on your own?" exclaimed Mrs. Brown. "Whatever did you do for food?" Unlocking the suitcase, the bear took out an almost empty glass jar. "I ate marmalade," it said. "Bears like marmalade." Mrs. Brown looked at the label around the bear's neck. It said quite simply, "Please look after this bear. Thank you." "Oh, Henry," she cried, "we can't leave him here all by himself. There's no knowing what might happen to him. Can't he come home and stay with us?" "Stay with us?" repeated Mr. Brown nervously. He looked down at the bear. Would you like that?" he asked. "That is," he added hastily, "if you have nothing else planned." "Oh yes," replied the bear. "I would like that very much. I've nowhere to go, and everyone seems in such a hurry." "That settles it," said Mrs. Brown. "Now you must be thirsty after your journey. Mr. Brown can get you some tea whilst I go and meet our daughter Judy." "But Mary," said Mr. Brown, "we don't even know its name." Mrs. Brown thought for a moment. "I know," she said. "We'll call him Paddington, after the station." Paddington. The bear tested it several times to make sure. It sounds very important. Mr. Brown tried it out next. "Follow me, Paddington," he said. "I'll take you to the snack bar." Mr. Brown was as good as his word. Paddington had never seen so many snacks on one tray, and he didn't know which one to try first. He was so hungry and thirsty that he climbed up onto the table to get a better look. Mr. Brown turned away, pretending he had tea with a bear at Paddington Station every day of his life. "Henry," cried Mrs. Brown when she arrived with Judy, "what are you doing to that poor bear?" Paddington jumped up to raise his hat, but in his haste he slipped on a strawberry tart, skidded on the cream, and fell over backwards into his cup of tea. "I think we'd better go before anything else happens," said Mr. Brown. Judy took hold of Paddington's paw. "Come along," she said. "We'll take you home, and you can meet Mrs. Bird and my brother Jonathan." Mr. Brown led the way to a waiting taxi. "Number 32 Windsor Gardens, please," he said. The driver stared at Paddington. "Bears is extra," he growled. "Sticky bears is twice as much, and make sure none of it comes off in my interior. It was clean when I set out this morning." The sun was shining as they drove out of the station, and there were cars and big red buses everywhere. Paddington waved to some people waiting at a bus stop, and several of them waved back. It was all very friendly. Paddington tapped the taxi driver on the shoulder. "It isn't a bit like Darkest Peru," he announced. The man jumped at the sound of Paddington's voice. "Cream!" he said bitterly. "Cream and jam all over my coat!" He slid the little window behind him shut. "Oh dear, Henry," murmured Mrs. Brown. "I wonder if we're doing the right thing." Fortunately, before anyone had time to answer, they arrived at Windsor Gardens, and Judy helped Paddington onto the pavement. "Now you're going to meet Mrs. Bird," she said. "She looks after us. She's a bit fierce at times, but she doesn't really mean it. I'm sure you'll like her." Paddington felt his knees begin to wobble. "I'm sure I shall, if you say so," he replied. "The thing is, will she like me?" "Goodness gracious!" exclaimed Mrs. Bird. "What have you got there?" "It's not a what," said Judy. "It's a bear called Paddington, and he's coming to stay with us." "A bear?" said Mrs. Bird as Paddington raised his hat. "Well, he has good manners, I'll say that for him." "I'm afraid I stepped on a jam tart by mistake," said Paddington. "I can see that," said Mrs. Bird. "You'd better have a bath before you're very much older. Judy can turn it on for you. I dare say you'll be wanting some marmalade too." "I think she likes you," whispered Judy. Paddington had never been in a bathroom before. While the water was running, he made himself at home. First of all, he tried writing his new name on the steam on the mirror. Then he used Mr. Brown's shaving cream to draw a map of Peru on the floor. It wasn't until a drip landed on his head that he remembered what he was supposed to be doing. He soon discovered that getting into a bath is one thing, but it's quite another matter getting out again, especially when it's full of soapy water. Paddington tried calling out, "Help!" at first in a quiet voice so as not to disturb anyone, and then very loudly, "Help! Help!" When that didn't work, he began bailing the water out with his hat. But the hat had several holes in it, and his map of Peru soon turned into a sea of foam. Suddenly, Jonathan and Judy burst into the bathroom and lifted a dripping Paddington onto the floor. "Thank goodness you're all right," cried Judy. "We heard you calling out." "Fancy making such a mess," said Jonathan admiringly. "You should have pulled the plug out." "Oh," said Paddington, "I never thought of that." When Paddington came downstairs, he looked so clean that no one could possibly be cross with him. His fur was all soft and silky, his nose gleamed, and his paws had lost all traces of the jam and cream. The Browns made room for him in a small armchair, and Mrs. Bird brought him a pot of tea and a plate of hot buttered toast and marmalade. "Now," said Mrs. Brown, "you must tell us all about yourself. I'm sure you must have had lots of adventures." "I have," said Paddington earnestly. "Things are always happening to me. I'm that sort of a bear." He settled back in the armchair. "I was brought up by my Aunt Lucy in darkest Peru," he began, "but she had to go into a home for retired bears in Lima." He closed his eyes thoughtfully, and a hush fell over the room as everyone waited expectantly. After a while, when nothing happened, they began to get restless. Mr. Brown tried coughing. Then he reached across and poked Paddington. "Well, I never," he said. "I do believe he's fast asleep." "After all that's happened to him," said Mrs. Brown, "is it any wonder?"
Paddington, Paddington, Paddington Bear, Paddington.
I hope you had lots of fun drawing Paddington Bear today and creating texture. Keep creating, my friends. Don't forget to send me pictures of your wonderful work, and I will see you soon.
Paddington, Paddington, Paddington Bear. He came from Peru to be with me and you. He's a very rare sort of bear.